You will be glad to know, I'm sure, that I'm finally sitting down and writing a book, my first book. I have the outline here for about 8 books that could be ready to roll at any time. I think the time is right now. After the Warren Commission completed their work, or long before it, I began to collect the information. And now the House Select Committee has completed their work and is ready to publish their findings with a sentence or a remark that the Justice Department should take it from there. They dropped the hot potato and gave money back that they didn't use. Even though they're allocated $6 million, they returned money and closed shop. And I feel now the time is right. So I'm writing hardly any letters. If you just get a quick thank you for articles or books that you're sending, it'd be short sentences. And I'm not taking phone calls usually during the day, and I'm working on, my goal was to begin June the 1st and work up till the middle of August. And I've cut off the telephone conversations and going down to Big Sur or wherever, the recreation part, and just staying and doing the work, allocating about 4 hours a day, and it should get done. So if I'm not as sociable as I've usually been in the past, forgive me, but that's the schedule, and I'm sure you appreciate what it is. It's hard to cut the daily newspapers and file those and assimilate the information, and I'll be keeping up with the tapes and write a book at the same time. That is the June, July, and part of August work that I have set for me. The number one story, of course, this week in the headlines, which I've duplicated just a piece of it for you in the San Francisco Chronicle at least, probers plan to call the JFK killing a conspiracy. And as I said on my front sheet here that I'm sending to you with the tape, I waited 15 years for this headline, and here it is. I also have listed a few of the tapes that have discussed the John Kennedy assassination and the House Select Committee on assassinations, because there's new people taking the tapes all the time, and I'm not going to repeat, or hope I don't repeat, the information that is on the past tapes. On tape number 370, I have a triangle of the layers of the cover-up. Right now, they're at a stage, I call it stage 4, and they have a few more places to go before the truth is told. But being as the House Select Committee has suggested the Justice Department keep pursuing this, and being as Volume 5 in the Warren Commission hearings has J. Edgar Hoover under oath with Gerald Ford, who is then a member of the Warren Commission, confirming that this case is open for all time, I hope maybe that the book that I do will be the wedge into opening it up a third time properly. I was a wedge it was 7 years ago, next week, the Watergate story, when the men were arrested at the Watergate Hotel, and I have told this on other tapes, and I think I will repeat it over and over, to show the power of information, because I keep saying that information is power. And we can go into Mr. Vorster's resignation in South Africa based upon some documents that were taken. He finally was removed from power there. Information is power. And just 7 years ago, the day after the men were arrested at Watergate, I picked up the telephone and called Bernard Fensterwald, who's now the attorney for Mrs. Paisley, the CIA agent who has either been murdered or disappeared, for sure disappeared because the corpse didn't resemble John Paisley. But Bernard Fensterwald had a committee to investigate assassinations, a CIA front. He siphoned information in and then somewhat suppressed it or used it, but never would unfold the real story of the assassinations. He's helped keep the lid on the story. But I told him that the men arrested at Watergate Hotel were involved in the Kennedy assassination. These were the same thieves and persons who were taking away our democratic process and replacing it with a fascism, a creeping or galloping fascism, and they were tampering again with the electoral process. G. Robert Blakey did not do a good job with the $6 million that he was allocated and 2.5 years of time, but money is easy to get, and the years go fast, and now we're ready for the next story about the John Kennedy assassination. I will make a few comments about the article that came in the New York Times this week. G. Robert Blakey had an interview. He's a professor of law at Cornell. He went back to Cornell. Help us if the law profession is taught by these cover-up artists. That's why we have so many liars meeting the press, facing the nation, on prestigious commissions because their professors are an example of the best way, the brightest and the best of the country in covering up. Robert Blakey teaches at Cornell, as I say, had 2 years and $5 million, and almost the last witness before the tape recordings of an extra shot over by the grassy knoll appeared, almost the last witness was Santos Traficanta from organized crime. And then they closed shop real fast. They had a hot potato, and they let it go. Some comments, as I say, about the New York Times article, one quotation, the conspirators may have included organized crime figures, Cubans, and James Hoffa, former president of the Teamster. This will be one of their conclusions. Well, that's a very safe place to draw the line. I didn't provide the House Select Committee on Assassinations with any information except two things: tapes, articles, not published articles, but documents on two areas. One was the area of N.K. Fields, and I did 2 tapes on N.K. Fields and the Mexican connections that you can get if you don't have. Many of you have them. They were tapes 280 and 281, August 1st and 8th, 1977. I sent those tapes and I sent the information because Mr. Fields lives in Sacramento. He's old and he's crippled, and he lived in Mexico a long time, and he knows where there's access to pictures of Lee Harvey Oswald in Mexico with persons from the CIA that all poured into Mexico after the Bay of Pigs operation. And part of that conspiracy was the discussion down there to set up Lee Harvey Oswald as a patsy, and there also was a double in Mexico. I also gave the House Select Committee on Assassinations through Yvonne Burke and other members the information of Lee Harvey Oswald, the Alexander Zeiger family in the Soviet Union at the Minsk radio factory, the CIA connections of Lee and Marina Oswald to the Zeiger family, to the Nazis in Argentina, and the defense agencies in the CIA. I might add that even though I sent all of this to them and went to the expense of sending tapes and registering and so forth, I never got a sentence, a phone call, a comment. Even though they gave money back to the Congress that they didn't need for the investigation, they didn't take a $200 or $300 plane trip to Carmel, California to see any of these documents. I went at my own expense to see Jim Garrison after he had arrested Clay Shaw in New Orleans to get information on the assassinations, to compare our work or to assist him if I could in any way. But that House Select Committee was given a mandate, and they wouldn't even come out here to get that information or to see it or to answer my letter, a 15-cent answer, or an 80-cent phone call. They didn't want that information, and those were two of the key areas: the doubles of Oswald, the Mexican connections, and the Minsk radio connections. That is why they are sitting on a hot potato, because it's much easier to say Carlos Marcello or the dead Jimmy Hoffa or Santos Traficanta got away with his terrible murders. Lee Harvey Oswald, if it was Oswald, John Kennedy, and then the poisoning and cancer of Jack Ruby to wipe out all the witnesses. The New York Times article says that they didn't have a meeting place where they discussed the planning of the murder. That is not true, actually. The Senator Church Committee in 1976 revealed that there was a meeting place at the Plaza Hotel, that the date was 1960, that the person was Robert Mayu, who worked for the FBI, for CIA counterintelligence, for the Howard Hughes Empire, which was a cover for CIA espionage, and at that hotel in that year he met with members of organized crime to form assassination teams. Now, the fact that they were hired to kill Fidel Castro does not mean they weren't set up to kill anybody else. They were never asked that question. They're naming one person that has been overexposed by the media, but nobody else. Now, the very members of that team that worked with Robert Mayu, that began their organizations through the CIA and FBI at the Plaza Hotel, were Sheffield Edwards of the CIA, John Rosselli, Carlos Prios-Siqueiros, George de Morenchild, William Harvey, William Sullivan, Sam Giancana, Nicholas Nicoletti. All those persons were killed within 2 years when Church called a few of these people as witnesses, such as John Rosselli, Sheffield Edwards, and William Harvey. They were dead immediately after Senator Church's hearings. When the House Select Committee began their investigations, then William Sullivan was killed, Sam Giancana, and Nicholas Nicoletti, and Carlos Prios-Siqueiros. So from the intelligence agencies, the FBI, the CIA, and the defense, Sheffield Edwards and John Paisley, when the House Select Committee began their work, William Harvey, Carlos Priego Sequeiros, who was the former president of Cuba, who worked with the Cuban community and with the intelligence in the United States, William Sullivan of the FBI, George de Mohrenschildt of the FBI, the CIA and the defense agencies, all worked together, were dead, and Rosselli, Hoffa, Jimmy Hoffa, Sam Giancana, Nicoletti, the crime members, were dead, which leaves them with Santos Trafficana and Carlos Marchella. Bruce Roberts, who wrote the Gemstone File and gave it to me in the summer of 1972, right after my Watergate story broke, had told me, and I've mentioned this before on other tapes, that it was Carlos Marchella, the member of organized crime from New Orleans, who set up the car crash of where my daughter Bonnie was killed and Barbara was in the car, and that was in 1970, about 3 weeks after Bernard Fensterwald had visited my home for 3 days in Carmel. I'd been to New Orleans with Jim Garrison in 1967. In 1970 was the time of the crash in December. One of these two crime members named by the House Select Committee on Assassinations, his name was given to me by Bruce Roberts in 1972 as setting up that car crash. 3 were killed, 6 were badly injured and almost died. Now, if Mr. Robert Blakey says that Santos Trafficano and Carlos Marchella seem to be the guilty ones, or the fingers are pointing to them, it's difficult to believe as evil or corrupt as, say, somebody like Earl Warren could be, even possibly that scandal of a single crime that he was involved in. How could Earl Warren and John J. McCloy, chairman of Chase Manhattan Bank, the originator of the OPEC Combine, the Oil Sisters, the oil intrigue and control that they have over our lives, meeting with all these oil leaders, Senator Richard Russell of Georgia, Gerald Ford from Michigan, House Member Gerald Ford, Hale Boggs of Louisiana, Representative Cooper, Alan Dulles, former director of the CIA. There were 22 or more attorneys for the CIA and a large staff and secretaries only from the CIA, according to the minutes of the Warren Commission members that were transcribed by David Lifton and printed. Why would all of these people cover up for Santos Trafficana, Jimmy Hoffa, and Carlos Marchella, the world's leaders? A president of the United States is murdered. Why would all these people cover up? There's been links of Earl Warren, his discovery by Murray Chotiner, and Chotiner, we know, was behind Richard Nixon's career with close links to members of organized crime. But Lyndon Johnson, as President of the United States, ordered the Warren Commission to investigate this matter. He locked up evidence for more than 75 years, the year 2037 it is now, to keep the conspiracy shut up till all of us on planet Earth would be dead by that time. Johnson was ridiculed by a play in New York, McBird. The finger was always pointed at him for covering up the murders. Hard to believe that Carlos Marchella and Santos Trafficana had the control over the government. And if they do, you're in worse trouble than you think. If those two men can control the Justice Department and the Pentagon and send in Mr. Otto Winnecker, a German from the Pentagon, to write the Warren Report, then there isn't a hair's breadth difference between the defense intelligence agencies and organized crime and the syndicate. And if you think Pope Paul VI was a member of the OSS and the American intelligence community, maybe there isn't. Maybe that's what this whole shtick is about, is getting everybody drugged and doped and ripping them off and killing them. I don't know. But it just seems that they've opened up a Pandora's box by trying to blame it on these two slobs, because I don't think they'll take it, and maybe they'd be threatened with deportation or arrest, and they'll keep quiet. The New York Times article says regarding the John Kennedy assassination, there's no evidence, as I say, that a meeting took place where the murder was planned. Well, there was evidence at that hotel, the year the man, Robert Mayu, was alive, and they could call him in. They didn't call him in as a witness, even though he set up assassination teams and all that money and large groups of men just to kill Fidel Castro. Murders aren't planned that way anyway. If you hear the White House tapes, and if Nixon had still been president, he says, we better do something about Trudeau. Is that an order to kill Trudeau? If he says you have to take care of Magruder, does that mean that G. Gordon Liddy goes out with a gun and thinks that's an order to kill him? He did, and somebody stopped him. All you have to do is say, take care of Magruder. Now, Liddy doesn't know who orders the killings. He would just kill. He was told to kill, he would kill. That's not the way killings are done. The upper echelon know what they're doing, and it's very seldom that people hear the orders to kill. That news story came out this week about the killing of Admiral Darlan. I'm going to go into that in a minute, where a woman is alive who sat in at the time that the Count of Paris ordered the murder of Darlan in South Africa. That was just revealed before she died this week. Interesting story because of its links to the Kennedy assassination and why history is a continuous change. But they don't sit in a room, and the people around usually don't talk. This woman is talking. It's 36 years later. It doesn't usually happen that way. The House Select Committee on Assassinations is quoted as saying, there is no account of the details of the plot. There is circumstantial evidence to connect the death of the president to elements of organized crime, not a national crime syndicate, nor to an individual. It's not the whole syndicate. Heavens, don't think that. Or don't pin it on Hoffa. No. But there is an element of organized crime enough to connect this evidence to the death of the president. That won't wash either. Think of all the evidence that's been destroyed of this crime. The bullets that J. Edgar Hoover tested in 1964 that weren't tested again in 1978 because they were different bullets, that they had the neutron activation test. Kennedy's brains in the archives. Do members of the syndicate or crime control where his brains were to see if one or more bullets were fired from different weapons because of the metal in the brains? How about the voice prints of Oswald that the CIA tape recorded on telephones in Mexico? Pardon me. And we've never heard those. Or pictures of a man going to the embassy using Oswald's name. It has never been identified. The CIA safe house on Neely Street where Lee Harvey Oswald stayed, where that famous picture was taken of him holding a rifle, pistol, and a communist piece of literature, and then the case was solved within hours. Or the disappearance of John Paisley, that complicated matter where the Maryland police, the FBI, the CIA are all involved. Who destroys the clothing of John Connolly so they can't find if the bullets were entry bullets when it was dry cleaned? Who destroys the lamppost files, the Oswald 201 files, Oswald's box office, his post office applications that were missing, the street signs that were missing, because there could be bullet fragments from over the grassy knoll. That street sign was removed. The interior of the car sent to Michigan and destroyed. Important witnesses not called. Who was doing all that? Not Jimmy Hoffa. He didn't do all that, and neither did Carlos Marcellos. I haven't ever in 15 years seen records of Carlos Marcellos going in and out of Bethesda Hospital at the time of the autopsy and picking up the undeveloped x-rays, or writing the autopsy report for Commander Hume and burning the next one, or sneaking into the archives to take away Kennedy's brains, or going down to the Atomic Energy Commission group and changing the bullets that were tested that came out of the body of John Kennedy and John Connolly found in the car. I haven't seen Carlos Marcello creeping around any of these places. I don't even know if he leaves New Orleans or Baton Rouge, his headquarters, but certainly he didn't mishandle at least 36 pieces of major evidence that falsify information, and he didn't run the investigation of the Warren Commission where they agreed that they wouldn't cross-examine witnesses, that they wouldn't tape record their first conversations and rehearsals of their testimony, and all the perjury, the outright lies that went on. If Carlos Marcellos is the voice box of Marina Oswald, that's the greatest trick I've ever heard. They didn't do all that, and obviously this isn't going to wash, but the story is there is a conspiracy, and they've gotten as far as the Cubans in Marcello and Traficanta. Coincidentally, the government had their excuse for wiretapping was to get members of organized crime, which they very seldom ever pull in on that charge. But when it came to the push and shove, the two people that they never wiretapped were the very people that worked with Robert Mayu, Santos Traficanta, and Carlos Marcello. And the reason they didn't ever wiretap them was, I'm sure, for the purposes of concealing their own work as espionage agents working for the United States government. The New York Times headlines on this JFK killing conspiracy say that Traficanta and Marcello both had dealings with Jack Ruby. That, I believe, Ruby had dealings with organized crime members in Louisiana, Baton Rouge, and New Orleans, Las Vegas, Chicago with Sam Giancana. He had talked on the phone to Sam Giancana. He did have those links. But they also are writing reports saying that Ruby and Lee Harvey Oswald had links to organized crime. Now, that's a catchy one that you have to watch when this report comes out, and we have to work on more. In 15 years, I never saw in any of the 15 volumes or books, any evidence, hard evidence, that Lee Harvey Oswald worked with organized crime. He worked with Max Clark, who was chief of security at Convair, General Dynamics. He worked with members of Navy intelligence. He worked with CIA agents in the Soviet Union, Mr. McVicker and Schneider, Priscilla Johnson, Eileen Mosby. He was with CIA and Alexander Zeiger. He worked with George de Mohrenschildt, a Nazi FBI, CIA agent, and members of the Central Intelligence Agency of Paul Rygota-Rodsky and George Bowie and Anna Meller and Lydia Dimitri. And many of those, 22 of those, who came to the United States through the CIA Tolstoy Foundation, and members of the CIA front of the Greek Orthodox Church. Lee Harvey Oswald's connections to the intelligence community are overwhelmingly strong, and not with organized crime. But that's why it's time for me to write my books, because I've given all those other gigs 15 years to put out 200 books that don't scratch the surface. Maybe one or two talk about de Mohrenschildt. I think A.J. Weberman's coup d'etat, a few of them. Very few get to the intelligence community, because that is the second half of the investigation, now that they can admit there's a conspiracy. But I do not believe that Lee Harvey Oswald worked with organized crime. His link was with the intelligence community, who did work with organized crime, and then select him as a patsy, or his double to be selected as a patsy, and to kill them. As I say, the report will urge, in quotes, the Justice Department to renew efforts to try to determine who worked with Oswald to plot and carry out the murder of President Kennedy. What's wrong with that sentence? I'll read it one more time. In quotes, this is from the House Select Committee report, the New York Times account. In quotes, the report will urge the Justice Department to renew their efforts to try to determine who worked with Oswald to plot and carry out the murder of President Kennedy. Now, Lee Harvey Oswald did work with people who plotted. He did agree to be in the Texas School Book Depository after October of '63. He was a decoy. He left the building, he left the front, got in the car of Michael Paine. He did have close associations with the assassinations. He did not kill the president. That will be my second book in the order of priority. I'm doing another one first, but because I think it's the most interesting and the most important. It should go the other order, that Lee Harvey Oswald didn't kill anybody, but I'm choosing another book first, and the second book hopefully will be the proof that Lee Harvey Oswald didn't fire a gun and didn't kill anybody. The Justice Department has been asked to find out who worked with Oswald to plot and carry out the murder, and that is the important question. Not who helped Oswald kill the president, but who worked to plot and carry out the murder of the President Kennedy, because that is what the House Select Committee on Assassinations should have done when they spent their $6 million in their 2.5 years' work, and I disagreed with all the researchers who assisted them back there. The primary thing to do in that investigation was to prove that Lee Harvey Oswald fired a rifle that day, because if he didn't, the investigation would have taken an entirely different turn. And because there is no proof of the ownership of the rifle, no proof that he picked it up at that mailbox or ever saw it, no fingerprints or physical evidence, not a hair or a piece of physical evidence to link him, or a palm print, which the FBI knew, and I have the documents, knew he didn't touch that rifle. There is no evidence linking him carrying it into the building. The package he had was too small. There is no way that he fired it. The view was obscured. He wasn't on the 6th floor. The elevator didn't work. He was downstairs having a drink. Yes, he was in the building. Yes, he left the building. Yes, he was in New Orleans with the people who plotted it. He was in Mexico with the people who plotted it. That's all. he was a patsy, he was a decoy, and then turned into a patsy. But his name was also used in plans in Chicago to kill a president. In Miami, they were to have a patsy, and he went along with this part of it. So the Justice Department will be asked to renew their efforts, and they will continue. But the important thing is that the House report will say that there was a plan to kill John Kennedy, that there was a conspiracy. They have too much evidence right now to cover this thing up. At least all the way. They're halfway there, as I said before. This is the 11th anniversary of the death of Robert Kennedy. There was a pitiful picture of Ethel and Ted sobbing at the funeral, not the funeral, at the cemetery. I'm sure all of you saw it. Ted's holding a rose and crying, and Ethel's holding a rosary. I have the utmost disrespect for this despicable, miserable combination of people. The best living memory is not to avenge, not eye for an eye, but find out who killed so that the killings stop. The killings haven't stopped, and these people have allowed the headlines that we see today to take place, I believe, because of the change of hands of this government. I see articles, the Iranian thugs beheaded a wealthy Jewish woman. They tore into her house and cut her head off and said this is only the beginning. The independent truckers are cutting off links of food to the stores. The water is polluted all over the country. Radiation overdoses at labs. Health officials warning about herbicides, poisonings on pot or marijuana. Aliens are being registered by computers. Funds cut off for mental health. I can go on and give you 90 things that happened in our country since John Kennedy and Robert Kennedy were killed that I believe might have changed had anybody with a bit of decency not turned the government over to the Nazis. But this poisoning of the people, poisoning the food, the water, the mines, the computers for people coming in and out of the country on the excuse that too many aliens get in, you're going into a nightmare age, and you're going in there for the simple reason that we haven't made the effort, enough effort to expose these people. And certainly Ethel and Ted Kennedy never appeared at any single hearings or gave a minute's support to anybody who had the most patriotic purposes in finding out who murdered Robert Kennedy and John Kennedy and Mary Jo Kopechne. They are caught grieving, but in between, they wouldn't answer a letter from a researcher or give them the nod of a head or give them any kind of acknowledgement that the deaths of John Kennedy and Robert Kennedy made a bit of difference. For Ethel, it's nothing but a Robert Kennedy tennis tournament every year, and they have a big social get-together. Instead of having that same energy directed to finding out who killed her husband, it's become a social event, one of the big social events of the year. The Pope is kicking up a storm. Those of you who have my back tapes know in November of this year, tapes number 362, 363, and 364 about the Polish Pope. He's in Europe damning the communists. He didn't go to Mexico and give speeches against the fascist regimes of Nicaragua and Brazil and Argentina, Uruguay, Paraguay, Guatemala, terrible places where torture, missing people, goon squads, death squads of even good Catholics wiped out and priests, assassinated. He's there rallying up a country that is fascist. Our National Security Council advisor, Brzezinski, is from that country. Maybe you saw an article this week about Polish Jewry. There's only 5,000 people of Jewish religion in Poland. Before the war, there were 3.5 million Jewish scholars, writers, artists, musicians, actors, and scientists. There are now about 5,000 Jews and not one child, not one under the age that would give birth to a child. It's going to be a country entirely void of Jews. But he went to Krakow, his home base, and if you look at the tapes, I have the maps of his home country, and he went to the scene of the crime yesterday. He went to Auschwitz, where he worked in a rock quarry, where he was a chemist for I.G. Farben. Farben made the chemicals that exterminated all the Jews in Poland and other concentration camps. The Pope chided the communists in Poland for never allowing his predecessor, the one before John Paul I that was murdered, Pope Paul VI, they never allowed him to come into Poland. He called him the Pope of our millennium, and yet that was the very Pope, as Secretary of the Vatican, who wrote the passports for the Nazis to leave Europe, to go out to the Middle East and to South America and Central America and Middle Asia, China, all over the world to the United States. He wrote passports for the top Nazis to leave, and he's chiding these people that they didn't let the Pope of the millennium come in. Within a few years, there won't be a single Jew in all of Poland, nor a synagogue. Nothing is being renovated. This is tape number 392, and it's side 2 of June the 8th, 1979. When Jimmy Carter made Brzezinski the head of the National Security Council, considering the human rights or the state of religion in Poland, past and present, it's a scandal. And when the Polish Pope makes his tour and talks about human rights, it's a scandal. And he was immediately put in following the death of John Paul I, and never a question about his role in Krakow or at Auschwitz, which was Auschwitz, and who he worked for and what he did there during the years of the war. They said he worked in an underground, but he worked for the IG Farben Nazi underground, and he went to visit Auschwitz yesterday. Interesting, being as there's no Jews left in Poland, that he goes to visit Auschwitz yesterday, the scene, as I said, of his crimes and the crime of cover-up. Political assassinations, goodness knows, didn't start with the murder of President John Kennedy, but my political awareness began then, and I was 40 years old. So there's many of you who take these tapes who are interested, who are not politically active, but you can get your energy into doing a lot more, and people out there certainly could do a lot more if they put their attention to the subject and believed in it enough. I began to study the murder of John Kennedy and immediately came across the massive cover-up of that Warren Commission, people like Gerald Ford, and then he gets to be promoted President of the United States, or Leon Jaworski, who worked with the Warren Commission. And by studying the Kennedy assassination, it brought me into the whole realm of history, how broad it is, and other political assassinations, and how the world is altered by two things. One, by bullets, and two, by blackmail. Those are the ways that people, slavery, labor, minerals, the air around us, the oil, the energy, going even to solar energy, everything that affects us is controlled. The food we eat, and our transportation, and our medical care, the assistance we get, the care for the mentally sick, society is controlled by bullets and blackmail. And if you're lucky enough to have people who are not hungry for power or greedy, such as in Scandinavian countries, you have a fairly calm and quiet society without large mass and crazy massacres. And when you have power grabs, you get heavy doses of narcotics and thievery and prisons and fascism of the worst kind in direct proportion to the greed. There was an article last week, I briefly mentioned it on the other side of the tape. It says Paris is talking about the Darlan murder. I don't know if you saw it. It was in Reuters just this last week, and it's described as the murder that changed the course of French history, and it goes back to December, Christmas Eve of 1942. That was a long time ago. The Count of Paris, the pretender to the French throne, was hoping that when World War II is over, that he would become the head of France instead of Charles de Gaulle. And he's been exposed as being the man who ordered the murder of Darlan, and a woman who was present when the murder was ordered has come forward. She's quite old now. She's 71 years old. Alain Decaux from the French Academy, famous historian, had a television program about the pretender of the throne of France during World War II ordering the murder of Darlan. Mrs. Dastier de la Bulgarie, I don't know if I pronounced it right, but I'll give you the printed name. said that she's opening up the matter, that she's been quiet for 36 years, but she was present when the monarchist ordered that Darlan had to be eliminated by any means. He was commander-in-chief of the French fleet. He was assassinated in Algiers. It had been occupied by the United States for just a few weeks. I have a book in my library, The Murder of Admiral Darlan, and as I've told some of you before, I think I'm developing the best private library in the United States on specifically political assassinations, and it grows just as fast as I can afford to get new books. I have one on Darlan, and now this woman who's 71 years old is saying after 36 years that she was present when the orders were given out by the pretender to the French throne to kill the commander-in-chief of the French fleet. Now, Darlan was a connecting link. He was the link of what has been described by Reuters as, in quotes, the mysterious men who led the European underground fascist movement. They were the links of the Nazis and the Allies, and they maintained their privileges on both sides no matter who won or lost. Now, that link is still going and was going immediately after World War II, this fascist Nazi link. If the Nazis lost, it was still maintained, and people went from the fascist side to the American side when they saw the fascists were losing, and that's where the pollution of the American system really began. Darlan was shot by a 20-year-old man who, when he was arrested, said that someone of importance would come and relieve him or rescue him, but he was executed 24 hours later, exactly like the nephew of King Faisal I mentioned last week, and then the oil prices jumped up as a result of that murder in Saudi Arabia. The Americans didn't want Charles de Gaulle in power. They were anxious to keep Charles de Gaulle from gaining power, and as a result, there developed that huge combine of these very fascists that were helping the pretender throne, the Count of Paris, get to power. They formed an organization called Permindex, which is the subject of the Torbet document, the unpublished manuscript that came out in 1970 on the Kennedy assassination. And there were several attempted assassinations of Charles de Gaulle, and it was when he put his intelligence team together to find out who was trying to kill him that he came across Permindex, and that was the organization that was behind the murder of John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, and Martin Luther King. So the point is that way back in December of 1942, when the admiral of the French fleet was killed in South Africa, there was a change of power. Darlan was murdered, and he was the connecting link of a lot of these Nazis. He knew of the espionage circles. He was similar or identical maybe to William Sullivan or William Harvey or Sheffield Edwards in the United States. And the espionage circles of the fascists were formed in right after World War I, but certainly in the 40s and 30s they were getting ready for fascism all over the world. There's a book, The Plot to Seize the White House, the plans to take over Roosevelt's role as a president of the United States, and there was Mussolini in Italy and Hitler in Germany, and as the United States was getting more powerful and entered into the war, and it was obvious they could possibly win this war again, then the fascists combined with the United States. And Permindex was formed. It has assassination teams, and it's a very important. Farewell America discusses this organization, that book Farewell America, and the Torbet document. But the continuous network for murders and for their cover-ups was set a long time ago. The monarchists did want back on the thrones. The monarchists helped fight the fascists because they didn't want a dictatorship. They wanted to be back on the throne in Spain and in Italy and in France. And the Count of Paris, who's still alive and old, is, I understand, angry about the report. But this woman has come out and talked about the murder of Darlan. And I think the importance of that murder, as I say, it happened in 1942. It may seem a long time ago to many of us, but the continuous links of these people and the way they murder and the way they cover up and the way they contract to murder, the way they kill the person who did the murder for them hasn't changed a bit. And that's why studying history is so interesting, and that's why when I studied the murder of John Kennedy, I could go back to Darlan and other assassinations, and then you can also watch the way someone like Governor Rockefeller can be killed, and that's hushed up. The techniques, the machinery is in motion. People are swept aside and murdered, And there is a formula and a pattern, and it's consistent, and studying history becomes interesting because of so many similarities through the entire technique of assassination and cover-up. I did several tapes, or briefly got into the scandal in South Africa. I should do more of it. The newspaper articles this week: one, South African blacks cheer the downfall of John Vorster. Another, Vorster, tied to South African scandal, quits as president of South Africa because he knew of a multi-million-dollar secret fund that was used to pay off the press and various persons that praised the glory of the racist country known as South Africa. Of course, that money went, admittedly, or early was exposed as going to Mrs. Thatcher in Great Britain. You saw a Nazi re-elected in Germany, a conservative elected in Canada, and then he gave a lot of money to a publisher in the United States in Michigan, the home state of Gerald Ford, Mr. McGough, in Michigan, in terms of millions of dollars, allegedly to buy the Washington Star. You don't have to buy the Star because it's owned by the New York Times, which is the same as a South African newspaper in terms of news coverage. But he went to Sacramento and bought the Sacramento Union. Now, that's important because this man took millions of dollars that was given to him from South Africa, and about $6 million, and then he invested it, Mr. McGough, in Sacramento. Mr. McGough owns the Panks chain, newspaper chain, in Michigan, Illinois, Florida, and Virginia. Now, how does South Africa affect newspapers in California, Sacramento, Virginia? For example, there was a plane crash in Virginia where Mr. Oberschen was going to run for the Senate and had a good chance of winning. A fatal plane crash, and John Warner became the person who won the Senate seat because of the plane crash, and John Warner is a staunch conservative, pro-South African in the United States Senate. You have a Lieutenant Governor, Mr. Dimely, who's a black man, had a near-fatal plane crash, just hopped the plane Sunday night instead of Monday that crashed in San Diego last September, and his successor, Mike Curb, protege of Ronald Reagan, a pro-South African, he got elected in. But what did the Sacramento Union do, or what does it do to expose Mike Curb, who's been linked with organized crime and other shenanigans in California? If a Sacramento newspaper is owned by South Africa, will it expose people who are favorable to South Africa, or will it cover them up? Why would South Africa send $6 or $10 million to Mr. McGough with newspapers in Michigan, Illinois, Florida, Virginia, and California? What editorials? What do they leave out? Where's the money going? And how does it serve South Africa? We have yet to see, but at least the scandal got Mr. Vorster out, and getting him out was like getting John Mitchell out at the time of Watergate. These secret funds were used for all kinds of purposes, and also he used to be the Minister of Justice, like John Mitchell was the head of the Attorney General in the United States. At least Mr. Vorster is out because of one person leaving and taking information about what they're doing and buying off other governments and propaganda with millions and millions of dollars to make themselves look good. At least pieces of paper and one or two concerned individuals can maybe change the course of a nation. Last week I talked about a juror at the Iranian trial in Beverly Hills that was killed, a judge in a narcotics trial in San Antonio, Texas that was killed, a witness to a lot of the San Francisco prison experiences, a bystander who was shot, who is going to survive that shot, but very important too. She worked with Charles Gary in his law offices, important to the Jonestown, Charles Gaines, chief of police connections and prison COINTEL programs in the San Francisco area. She was shot. Well, this last week in Birmingham, Alabama, a key government witness to a trial of the Ku Klux Klan was shot. But I wanted to show you how the judges, like Nazi Germany, are in collusion with these particular destructions of witnesses, how the courts are turned around. There's a trial going on of 17 members of the Klan that were charged with intimidating blacks and shooting at them, and the main witness in this particular case, Mr. Newton Bailey, loyal Newton Bailey, 49 years old, just at the day that the opening of the trial began, where 3 Klansmen have pleaded guilty and the others are on trial, he was shot in a parking lot and killed. And it's impossible to get trials going in this country. If you're going to kill the judges and the primary witnesses or defense attorneys, as this escalates and gets in the news media, people will be and are afraid to be witnesses against organized crime, against the Nazi police system, and or against the Klan. And if the witnesses are killed and it's totally covered up, how many witnesses are going to speak forward and stop this intimidation of the court system? Not only is the electoral process altered by bullets and ballots, but the court system is being conducted by the bullets also. I've saved articles for years on how many judges, district attorneys, attorney generals, defense lawyers, and jurors have been killed, and I've put them in files, and someday we'll do a book on that. Right away, the U.S. attorney, I don't know who appointed him, whether it was Gerald Ford or who, we have to go back and look up, but he said immediately, in quotes, "There is no evidence linking the death of the witness to the trial." Now that's like Ramsey Clark, the Attorney General, saying the night that Martin Luther King was killed, there is no evidence of a conspiracy, it's a lone gunman. Why do the U.S. attorneys have to say there was no evidence linking him to the death of the trial? J.R. Brooks is the U.S. attorney. Watch him become the Attorney General someday or work his way up. That's the way their careers grow. And if I sound cynical, I guess I am. Mr. Bailey's pockets had been turned inside out, and there was change around. A homicide inspector, Sergeant Gout, said the robbery was ruled out as a motive. He disagreed, of course, with the U.S. attorney. He said the man had a billfold with money, he had cash and a watch, and nothing was taken. Now here's the important thing. This Mr. Bailey that was killed in the parking lot would have testified about a gun that was used by the Klansmen in the testimony. This is what his part of the testimony that he was to give at this trial. The trial was just starting, and the opening statements were made. The lawyers had just given their opening arguments to the jury about the trial against 17 members of the Klan in Alabama when the primary witness was murdered in a parking lot. Then the judge immediately ordered the jury sequestered for the duration of the trial so that there's no way for them to know during the entire trial that their primary prosecution witness was murdered the day the trial began. Because the witness was murdered in the parking lot, the judge immediately sequestered all jury, locked up, so they would never know that the primary witness was murdered. Now, I think it would be important to try the Klan by letting the jury know that the prosecution had a witness and that he was murdered. This way, they get a weak prosecution, the Klan can get off, and the jury never knows that a man who would testify about a gun involved in the case was murdered in a parking lot, and that's why they were sequestered. That there was no reason for the U.S. Attorney, J.R. Brooks, to say that there were no links to the trial because he had no way of knowing. He sequestered the jury without their knowing. That is how people like Dan White get off, how members of the Klan get off, how Maurice Stan and John Mitchell got off, or John Connolly gets off. When the prosecution of the U.S. Attorney is weak, then the jury can't do anything but give a acquittal because all the evidence isn't presented to them. And it is a presentation of the evidence that is important to the conviction. And that's why the criminals are out on the streets, and that's why this particular U.S. attorney locked up the jury. He had no right to do it. The judge had no right to lock them up without their knowing that the prosecution had a witness who was murdered the day the trial began. A gentleman called KGO, that's a talk radio show in San Francisco, last week. I had called Jim Eason Monday afternoon to talk about Dan White and ask why the police had never put out a call for Dan White from the time he murdered the mayor and the supervisor until he turned himself in almost an hour later. He was within just a few miles of the police department, or any policeman within seconds in San Francisco, and they didn't photograph him handcuffed or brought in by the police. The beginning of the cover-up of that assassination hit in San Francisco was the collusion of the police to assist Dan White in giving the image of walking hand in hand with his wife, going to church, giving himself up, crying a confession to his best friend that was played on radios all over the city. And I called KGO about that, but right after I called in the afternoon, another gentleman called up and referred to Pier 39. That's a multi-million-dollar investment of a gentleman in San Francisco, restaurants and shopping center, and Dan White had a lease there. Well, he was on the board of supervisors. It's a potato restaurant down in this huge shopping mall. And a gentleman called in and said that the murder of the mayor and the supervisor was an assassination hit. Not a murder, it was assassination. These men represented, of course, the poor and the black and the gays in San Francisco. And he said the links were down at Pier 39, which have Nazi connections, he said on KGO. And I don't know who the man was who called in. He said it has to do with the Coors beer and their investment into Pier 39. And they called up the Adolf Coors people, KGO did, and my information is blurry about their answer to these allegations. But what he said was that the connection of Nazis to Pier 39, this multi-million-dollar compound, was the link to the Dan White White Knight murders in San Francisco. So people are becoming more aware of what I call the Nazification of America. In fact, not just as a figure of speech, the continuous process going back, way back, as I say, since World War I. But Pier 39 and the Nazi connections are linked to Dan White. That's what this gentleman said. I'll get more follow-up, but I've done many tapes on Dan White, so I just wanted to keep you up to date on that little bit. I am going to do a continuous update, a 1 hour or 2 hours on Alternative 3, and I'm getting mail about it. The only reason I'm waiting is that Avon Press is supposed to have the book out this month, and it will be more interesting for all of you if you have the book and read it before I do the update on it, because it is coming out, and it will be available. You can start asking your bookstores or write to research and send a check. I think it's $2.25 for the paperback. Fill out your orders, and then within another few weeks, as soon as it gets on the stands, we'll talk about Alternative 3. There is another subject that I've been wanting to get into, and I just think I'll do it on this tape to update you, because this is another area of the Nazification of this country, and this is the California violences that have been taking place in this state, the use of mind control of the police departments, police collusions, and the massacres, the setting up of the SLA, the Jonestown, the Zodiac Killer, the Manson family, the Nazi racist connections, goes into such activities as the Los Angeles Strangler. And because that subject's in the news this week, I just briefly want to give a little resume of that, because they have hypnotized this Strangler. He's up in Washington State. The Los Angeles Police Department didn't bring him in, but he killed several girls on a campus up there, and now he's confessed to murdering people in Los Angeles. 14 women were killed in Los Angeles starting in September 9th, 1977. The last one was murdered February 17th, 1978. The last woman who got away from the police department, there were policemen that picked her up, and this is the story that kept the case at a standstill until this present date. A woman filed a $1 million damage lawsuit against the police officers, Beth Ann Shannon. She said that after 13 women were strangled and murdered, that she was walking along the street one night and some men posing as a policeman tried to capture her, and 2 officers came. They were driving around Los Angeles, and they came to her and they said they were looking for a man that she said she thought resembled the Strangler. And these 2 police officers took her in their car. She got suspicious, and she asked them to let her out of the car. And one of the officers says, "Well, I hate to tell you," referring to the Strangler, "but it's us," the 2 policemen. And she got frightened and jumped out of the car, and I believe that they were trying to handcuff her. It involved handcuffs, and she was convinced that they were bona fide police officers. Afterwards, one officer was reprimanded and lost 2 days of salary, and one wasn't disciplined. They were simply given a hand slap, and she claims that there was emotional injury. But because they were police officers that came up to her and said that the Strangler is us. The case just reached, as I say, a total standstill. Now Kenneth Bianchi has been arrested in Bellingham, Washington, and has admitted that he did kill some of these women in Los Angeles. Now, Bianchi was a former security guard in Rochester, New York. He has a double personality of Steve Watkins, who does the murders. He's been attended by Donald T. Lund, L-U-N-D, Stanford University, who went up to Washington. And, of course, Stanford has been very much of the mind control program of these California violences. He has multiple personalities. They began by saying that he was a loner who had acne, who never had real parents. He was an orphan. He resented authority. But the important thing is that even though they give the profile of an Oswald Bremer Sirhan type, he wanted to become a police officer. He worked with police officers in Los Angeles. As I say, a security officer in Rochester, New York. He came to California in 1975, where he had a personality change. He was a ne'er-do-well, a drifter with no trained profession. He came to California and he was disheveled and worked then at California Land Title Company in Universal City. They didn't say what he did or where he ever got his training to work for such a place. And then suddenly, like Dan White, he pulls himself together. He's neatly dressed. He has confidence. His personality's changed. He gets advanced training program, and his old Chevy becomes a Cadillac. Does this all sound familiar? He carries an attaché case. He kept a bogus captain's badge of the police department. He had identification cards from the California Highway Patrol. He kept handcuffs in his attaché case, and he showed people his handcuffs and his pictures, and he told people he was doing undercover work for the Los Angeles police. He also had a diploma on his wall, a PhD from Columbia University, where he told people that he had gotten a PhD from Columbia while he was holding a job at the California Land Title Company at Universal City. This framed diploma was hanging in his office. He passed himself off as a trained psychotherapist, again, the mind control work. He dealt with one licensed psychologist, a Dr. Charles Weingarten in North Hollywood. He contacted him in 1977 and said he did marriage counseling and worked with families and asked to sublet space in Weingarten's office at the Federal Savings Building on Riverside Drive near the California Land Title Company, and he started working as a therapist and stayed at that office. He was, in quotes, very businesslike. They let him use the office, and Weingarten and Crowley, who were licensed social workers, shared that office suite, and he used it once or twice. They said he didn't have patient load, but he could have taken names or phone numbers of people or women that did visit the office who had marital problems. He sat in the office. He was one of the first suspects early in the killings, the strangling of these women. Chief of Police Gates said they never concentrated their efforts on him and they never followed him. And he had visited his cousin, who's now a suspect in the case, when he moved out to California in 1975. These murders were not solved by the Los Angeles Police Department, where this man had his identification card from the Highway Patrol, or handcuffs, or a badge. It was solved up in Bellingham, Washington, where he murdered several students, and then the Los Angeles story came out. He had applied to become a reserve with the police officers in Los Angeles and the sheriff's office. He was quoted, Daryl Gates, the chief of police in L.A., said he was a good student of police operations. Isn't it interesting how these ne'er-do-wells, no parents, from the time they were little losers, changing jobs frequently, end up passing themselves off as quite respectable, getting everywhere they want to go and having all the tactical support of the diplomas, the handcuffs, the highway patrol identification, the attaché cases, the badges, the offices in the psychiatrist or psychologist offices. Isn't it amazing how they fool people until the crime is committed, like David Berkowitz working with the police upstate New York, and many contacts. I should do an update on Son of Sam, David Berkowitz, in New York City. This story of Kenneth Bianchi reminds me of Dan White or David Berkowitz or many of these other violent people who have contacts. Charles Watson, who did all the murders of the Manson family, that Charles Manson didn't do, and Manson's the front man for that. These police contacts, sheriff contacts, psychologists, forged documents, handcuffs, badges, sudden personality changes, sudden arrivals in California from the East Coast, poverty to wealth, the Cadillacs, personality changes, similar to what Candy Jones had. When this man is caught, he didn't do the murders, this other person did the murders. Bianchi doesn't even remember. It's Steve Watkins, remember, who did these murders of all these various women in Los Angeles, moving out from Rochester, New York, and getting police protection. He could have been called in much, much earlier, but getting police protection until we get a large number of the murders. The Glass House Tapes by Louis Tackwood, published in 1976 by Avon Press, the same people that soon published Alternative 3, owned by Hearst, incidentally, has the best description of the Los Angeles Police Department and their shenanigans, and Dr. Delgado and the use of mind control and causing conspiracies, creating conspiracies, and it's good for the police department too. The cost of the Strangler case, in one article in Los Angeles Times, they had 134 new sworn officers assigned to the case, 8 civilians full-time, 30,000 hours of investigative work, 19 special officers making drawings, and so forth. It mushrooms into a business. The Strangler is a business. The SLA became a business for the FBI and the police department. The Manson was a business. The investigators, Charles Bates or Bugliosi, become the superstars. Ed Davis is now going to run for the Senate in California. He ran for governor, the chief of police behind all this. All this is business, and it is politically good because they use it for holding office later. Our criminals become our superstars and our governors and then our presidents. I'm sorry for rushing through that so fast, but we are out of time, and maybe I'll do more later, but I didn't want to lose track of the Strangler case.